Adeel Khan arrived at Gul Plaza before sunrise, unaware that the building he was about to enter would soon expose the darkest truth of his career. As a senior firefighter trusted to protect lives, he believed in rules, inspections, and systems designed to prevent disaster. By nightfall, he would stand surrounded by smoke, bodies, and unanswered questions, realizing that the real danger was not the fire itself, but the corruption that had turned a crowded workplace into a death trap. That single day would push Adeel Khan to uncover a hidden network of negligence and silence, transforming him from a responder at a tragedy into the man who dared to challenge the system behind it. Gul Plaza rose from one of Karachi's busiest commercial zones, a tired concrete structure surrounded by constant traffic, street vendors, and endless noise. From the outside, it looked like just another aging business center struggling to survive in a rapidly growing city. Inside, however, it carried the weight of years of neglect. Offices were cramped, corridors were narrow, and electrical cables hung loosely from ceilings like exposed veins. Despite repeated warnings from junior staff and shop workers, daily routines continued without concern. Profit mattered more than precaution, and safety was treated as an unnecessary expense. Every morning, hundreds of workers entered the building with familiar habits. Tailors powered sewing machines, clerks switched on old computers, and storage rooms filled with fabric rolls and chemical supplies remained locked and unventilated. Emergency staircases were blocked with cartons, and fire extinguishers were either expired or missing. The smell of dust, oil, and overheated wiring had become normal. Nobody questioned it anymore. Years of false security had trained everyone to ignore danger. On the day of the tragedy, the weather was unusually humid, trapping heat inside the building. Fans struggled, and overloaded circuits worked harder than usual. Somewhere on a lower floor, a spark formed behind a wall panel that had not been inspected in years. It burned quietly at first, feeding on plastic insulation and store materials. No alarm sounded. No warning system reacted. By the time smoke began creeping into hallways, the fire had already grown strong. Workers noticed irritation in their eyes and a strange burning smell. Confusion replaced routine as lights flickered and power failed. Smoke climbed upward, thick and fast, turning stairwells into sealed chimneys. Panic spread silently as people realized exits were locked or blocked. Windows refused to open. What had been an ordinary workday transformed into a nightmare. The fire gained strength within minutes, feeding on fabric, cardboard, and chemicals stacked tightly across multiple floors. Thick black smoke poured through ventilation gaps and stairwells, rising faster than the flames themselves. Visibility dropped to almost nothing as corridors filled with heat and toxic air. People rushed in every direction, driven by instinct rather than planning. Staircases that were meant to save lives became the first traps, turning into tunnels of suffocating smoke. Many tried to escape downward, only to find the lower levels completely engulfed. Others moved upward, believing fresh air would be easier to find above. With no working emergency lights, darkness added to the terror. Mobile phone signals weakened as panic calls failed to connect. Some collapsed from smoke inhalation before understanding what was happening. The building's design, altered illegally over the years, allowed fire to travel freely without resistance. Outside, passers-by noticed smoke pouring from sealed windows and shouted warnings that could not be heard inside. Metal grills prevented desperate hands from pushing outward. Glass cracked under heat, but rarely shattered enough to allow escape. Time stretched painfully as minutes felt like hours. The absence of a sprinkler system allowed flames to roll unchecked from one section to another, consuming everything in their path. When the first fire engines arrived, chaos had already reached its peak. Crowded streets slowed access, and parked vehicles blocked clear routes. Water hoses were connected, but pressure was weak due to illegal hydrant connections nearby. Ladders could not reach the upper floors where most victims were trapped. From above, silhouettes appeared briefly in smoke-filled windows before vanishing again. The fire roared on, indifferent to human suffering. Rescue attempts were limited, dangerous, and often unsuccessful. Each passing moment reduced the chances of survival. Among the emergency responders was a senior firefighter who had spent more than 20 years battling blazes across Karachi. He had seen factory fires, warehouse explosions, and residential disasters, yet something about Gul Plaza unsettled him the moment he arrived. The smoke was darker, heavier, and filled with a chemical sharpness that signaled a deadly environment. As he stepped closer, the heat pressed against his face shield, and the screams echoing from above made the situation painfully clear. He moved inside with a small team, navigating through corridors where visibility was reduced to inches. The building's layout made no sense, with walls added without planning and passages narrowed by storage. Breathing became difficult even with protective gear. Every step forward required testing the floor for weakness. In several offices, collapsed workers lay where they had fallen, overcome before they could reach help. The firefighter marked locations in his mind, knowing there would be no time to return for everyone. Water supply problems slowed progress. Hoses lost pressure repeatedly, forcing pauses while the fire continued to spread. Communication equipment malfunctioned inside the concrete structure, isolating teams from one another. The firefighter realized that this rescue was turning into a recovery mission far too quickly. Still, he pressed on, driven by duty rather than hope. On higher floors, conditions were worse. Temperatures soared, and thick smoke rolled along the ceiling like a living force. Attempts to reach trapped individuals failed as stairwells collapsed or became completely impassable. Each retreat felt like a personal failure. When the order finally came to pull back, exhaustion and frustration overwhelmed him. As dawn approached, the fire was brought under control. The building stood silent, blackened, and broken. The firefighter removed his helmet and looked back at Gul Plaza, knowing this tragedy had not been caused by fire alone. In the days following the fire, Karachi entered a period of grief and anger. Images of the burned building dominated news screens, while lists of the dead grew longer with each update. Families waited outside hospitals and morgues, searching for names and faces that might never return. Official statements described the incident as an unfortunate accident, blaming faulty wiring and human error. For many, that explanation felt too simple, almost rehearsed. The senior firefighter could not forget what he had seen inside Gul Plaza. The blocked exits, the sealed windows, and the absence of basic safety systems replayed constantly in his mind. As recovery operations continued, he began quietly reviewing old inspection files and departmental reports. What he found disturbed him deeply. Gul Plaza had been flagged multiple times over the years for safety violations. Notices had been issued, deadlines had passed, and yet the building continued to operate without meaningful change. Inspection records showed signs of manipulation. Dates did not match, signatures appeared copied, and some reports described safety features that clearly did not exist. Fire exits were marked as accessible despite being permanently locked or obstructed. Emergency equipment was listed as functional even though none had been found during the rescue. It became clear that the paperwork told a different story than reality. The firefighter realized the tragedy was not a sudden failure, but the result of a long pattern of neglect protected by silence. Each falsified report had allowed the building to remain open, placing hundreds of lives at risk every day. The fire had simply exposed what had been hidden for years. As public attention slowly shifted to newer headlines, the firefighter felt a growing responsibility. He understood that if the truth remained buried under official excuses, Gul Plaza would be forgotten like many disasters before it. As the firefighter continued his investigation, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The same names appeared repeatedly across inspection approvals, safety clearances, and renewal permits. These officials were responsible for dozens of buildings across the city, many of them known for overcrowding and poor maintenance. Gul Plaza was not an exception, but part of a much larger problem. Safety laws existed on paper, yet enforcement had been quietly replaced by personal gain. Financial records, and internal memos revealed how inspections were reduced to formalities. Buildings were approved without visits, and violations were ignored after small payments changed hands. Owners saved money by skipping safety upgrades, while inspectors protected their positions by cooperating. Complaints filed by workers and tenants were either delayed or closed without action. The system moved smoothly, but only because everyone involved benefited from its failure. The firefighter's work did not go unnoticed. Subtle pressure followed him wherever he went. His superiors began questioning his motives. Files he had accessed suddenly went missing. Transfer orders were hinted at, and warnings were delivered indirectly. The message was clear: stop digging. Yet each attempt to silence him only strengthened his resolve. He understood that remaining quiet would make him complicit in the deaths he had witnessed. Further investigation exposed how emergency response weaknesses were also ignored. Fire stations near Gul Plaza were underfunded, equipment requests had been delayed for years, and training programs existed only in reports. These failures ensured that when disaster struck, response would be slow and limited. The tragedy had been designed long before the fire ever started. With every document he collected, the firefighter realized the danger was no longer just institutional. It was personal. Still, he continued, knowing that the truth, once exposed. The most shocking discovery came when the firefighter uncovered a set of documents that had been deliberately buried. Among routine inspection files was a temporary closure notice issued only weeks before the fire. The building had been officially declared unsafe due to blocked exits, faulty wiring, and the absence of fire suppression systems. According to the order, all commercial activity inside Gul Plaza should have stopped immediately. Yet the building never closed, and business continued as if nothing had happened. Further review revealed that the closure notice had been quietly suspended. No written explanation justified the decision. Instead, a single handwritten remark approved continued operations pending future review. That review never came. The firefighter traced the approval to a senior authority whose name carried influence beyond the fire department. This intervention explained why lower-level officers had remained silent and why earlier warnings had disappeared from official records. The realization was devastating. The tragedy was not just predictable, it had been preventable. Workers who died in the fire had unknowingly walked into a building already marked as a threat to life. Families had lost loved ones not to chance, but to deliberate inaction. The fire itself became secondary to the crime that allowed people inside that day. The firefighter also discovered that similar closure notices existed for other buildings across the city. Many had been suspended in the same manner. Gul Plaza was simply the one where disaster finally struck. This pattern confirmed that the problem was systemic, not accidental. As these truths surfaced, the firefighter understood the risk of exposing them. Powerful figures were connected, and accountability would threaten established networks. Still, the weight of the evidence left him with no choice. The fire had taken lives, but the silence that followed would take many more unless someone forced. When the findings began to surface beyond internal files, the reaction was immediate and intense. Leaked documents reached independent investigators and journalists who recognized the scale of the corruption involved. News reports shifted focus from the fire itself to the system that had allowed it to happen. Public anger grew as people learned that Gul Plaza had been officially labeled unsafe before the tragedy. Protests formed outside government offices, and families of victims demanded accountability rather than compensation. Investigative committees were announced, and inquiries were promised, but progress moved slowly. Key officials avoided questioning, citing procedural delays and missing records. Some of the individuals named in the documents resigned quietly, while others were transferred to different departments. A few left the country altogether, taking advantage of legal loopholes and political connections. The firefighter watched as responsibility dissolved into bureaucracy. Court cases were filed, yet hearings were repeatedly postponed. Evidence submitted by investigators faced challenges, and technical objections slowed proceedings. Witnesses withdrew after experiencing pressure, and media attention gradually weakened as newer stories replaced Gul Plaza in the headlines. The system appeared to absorb the shock without changing its core behavior. Despite this resistance, the firefighters' exposure left a permanent mark. Policy discussions began around building safety, and limited reforms were announced to appease public outrage. Some inspection procedures were revised, and emergency response funding was briefly increased. However, deep structural change remained absent. For the families of the victims, justice felt distant and incomplete. Memorials replaced accountability, and apologies stood in for punishment. The firefighter realized that revealing the truth was only the first battle. Years passed, but Gul Plaza never truly left the memory of the city. The blackened structure stood abandoned for a long time, its damaged walls serving as a silent reminder of what had happened inside. People avoided the area, yet the story lingered in conversations whenever another fire broke out somewhere in Karachi. Each new incident echoed the same warnings that had been ignored before. The tragedy had become a symbol rather than an isolated event. The firefighter eventually retired from service, carrying the weight of what he had uncovered. His official role ended, but his testimony continued through reports, interviews, and recorded statements that refused to disappear. Though he never claimed victory, his work ensured the truth could not be completely erased. Future investigators and activists often referenced his findings when questioning safety failures across the city. Some changes did follow. New safety laws were announced, and high-profile inspections were carried out under public pressure. A few buildings were sealed, and emergency exits suddenly appeared in places where they had never existed. Yet beneath the surface, old habits slowly returned. Enforcement weakened as attention faded, and corruption found new ways to survive. Progress remained fragile and uneven. For the families of the victims, time softened grief but did not heal it. Compensation could not replace lost lives, and delayed justice felt like another betrayal. They continued to mark anniversaries, keeping the memory alive when the system preferred silence. Gul Plaza was no longer just a building. It was a warning written in smoke and loss. The untold truth was now known. The fire had exposed a system that valued profit over people. Until accountability became stronger than influence, the city would remain vulnerable. Gul Plaza's legacy was not only tragedy, but a challenge to remember, question, and refuse to look away again.